Since he announced his campaign for the presidency, Biden has taken a rather hostile stance towards Saudi Arabia, criticising both their domestic human rights record and their actions in Yemen, where the Saudis have been fighting what is essentially a proxy war against their regional rival, Iran. However, as global oil prices have risen, Biden has been forced into a slightly embarrassing U-turn, pleading with the Saudis to produce more oil to bring down prices. Unfortunately for Biden, the Saudis were apparently unconvinced, and last week OPEC decided to cut production by up to 2 million barrels per day, just a couple of weeks ahead of the midterms, provoking fury at the White House. So in this video, we're going to be explaining how Biden's evolving position on the Saudis, the significance of the recent OPEC cuts, and whether this spells the end of the 50-year Saudi-US relationship. As you may have seen in our recent video, the US channel really needs your support. So make sure you subscribe, like, comment and share to give this channel a chance of surviving into the new year. So let's start with a bit of context. On the presidential campaign trail, Biden was conspicuously critical of Saudi Arabia. He accused them of murdering children in Yemen and promised to turn Saudi Arabia into a, quote, pariah state for the killing of journalist and dissident Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, alongside various other human rights shortcomings. Now, this isn't entirely unsurprising. In the past, presidents have often taken strong stances against the Saudis on the campaign trail, only to soften once getting into office, which is why former Saudi ambassador to Washington, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, used to describe US election periods as the silly season. However, unlike previous presidents, Biden actually maintained his tough stance once he got into office, refusing to travel to Riyadh or even answer phone calls from Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia's de facto leader. Biden also actively tried to normalize relations with Iran by renegotiating the Iran nuclear deal, something the Saudis were never keen on, and reduced American support from Saudi Arabia in Yemen, delisting Iran-backed Houthis as terrorists and temporarily withdrawing Patriot missile batteries. This marked a pretty significant shift in US policy towards the Saudis. For most of post-war history, the US and the Saudis have basically been best mates. The relationship began in the 50s, when America needed oil and an anti-communist ally in the Middle East, and accelerated in the coming decades, with America buying Saudi oil and the Saudis buying American weapons. There have been occasional hiccups. Tensions were strained after 9/11 because the Saudis had given various lucrative government contracts to the bin Laden family, and there have been persistent tensions over the US's close relationship to Israel, which came to a head in 1973 when the Saudis banned all oil exports to America over its arms sales to Israel during the Arab-Israeli War. But every time, both sides have eventually repaired relations because, well, the Americans want cheap oil and the Saudis want American military support. Anyway, in response, the Saudis became equally frosty towards the US. Mohammed bin Salman, colloquially known as MBS, refused a call from Biden in March and improved relations with both Russia and China, which didn't go down too well in Washington. For context, Russia-Saudi relations have been improving since 2016, when the two countries decided to cooperate on oil exports. Saudi Arabia and Russia are the world's first and second largest oil exporters respectively, and Russia's decision to cooperate with Saudi Arabia and the other OPEC countries, known as OPEC+, gave the cartel almost total control over oil prices. However, when global oil prices began to rise a few months ago and Biden's poll numbers began to drop, he had to stage an embarrassing U-turn. Biden returned the Patriot missile systems, and in July, the president went to Riyadh to see MBS to ask him to produce more oil, which would in turn reduce prices. Conscious that the optics weren't great here, Biden actually penned an op-ed in the Washington Post defending his trip, claiming that he never meant to rupture the US-Saudi relationship, just, quote, reverse the blank check policy adopted by his predecessors. In the article, Biden reiterated his concerns regarding the kingdom's human rights record, but pointed out that they had agreed a truce in Yemen and were apparently, quote, working with American experts to stabilize the oil markets. Anyway, Biden's trip apparently didn't go so well, and in August the Saudis, along with the rest of OPEC Plus, agreed to raise production by a minuscule 100,000 barrels, despite the fact that oil was up about 100% year on year. For context, global oil consumption is roughly 90 million barrels per day, so the 100,000 for September represented just a 0.1% increase, and was the smallest hike since 1986. A month later, on September the 5th, OPEC Plus basically reversed course, cutting production by 100,000 barrels. Then, in yet another snub to both the US and Biden, last week OPEC Plus had another monthly meeting and this time decided to cut production by an astonishing 2 million barrels. It's definitely the largest cut the cartel has ever employed, while oil was flirting with $100 a barrel, which is when they usually increase output. Oil prices jumped roughly 5% on the news and will probably rise higher unless demand drops off or OPEC Plus changes course. The White House were predictably furious, describing the decision as short-sighted and accusing the Saudis of siding with the Russians, while the Russians praised the move as a, quote, balanced and thoughtful response to what is described as the, quote, mayhem sown by the United States in global energy markets. So why did the Saudis do this? Why did they shun the Americans in favour of the Russians? Well, there were a couple of potential reasons. For starters, the Saudis don't like the Russian oil price cap that NATO are discussing, simply because it would shift the balance of power away from producers towards consumers. Second, it's possible that MBS still hasn't forgiven Biden for comments he made earlier in his tenure, and is using the cuts to essentially punish the administration. Third, it might just be brute self-interest. The Saudis might be worried about a global recession, which would reduce demand, and they're trying to keep oil prices high for the foreseeable future to maximise revenues. Nonetheless, whatever the precise reasoning, the recent cuts have clearly strained the Saudi-US relationship, and the future trajectory doesn't look good. Saudi Arabia is growing increasingly close to not just Russia. The two countries have agreed to continue cooperating on oil production via OPEC Plus until 2024, but also China. As its economy has grown, China has become one of Saudi Arabia's largest consumers, and China has even started selling significant amounts of military hardware to the kingdom. On the other hand, the US shale boom of the 2010s means that the US imports less oil from the Saudis than it used to, and Democrats have become increasingly hesitant about providing arms to a country with such a questionable human rights record. Clearly, the long-standing US-Saudi relationship is under strain. Now, that's not to say that it's doomed. The two sides have definitely been through worse, only to be reunited by mutual self-interest. But it will require either Biden or MBS to offer some sort of geopolitical fig leaf, which doesn't look forthcoming. Anyway, make sure you subscribe, comment and like. The US channel has been struggling recently, and we're going to be covering a lot in the run-up to the midterms, so this would really help it survive into the next year. I can't deal with this building work, man.